It was supposed to be just another ordinary day. A quiet home in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other, children coming back from school, neighbors following their routines, the sense of safety that, in the 1970s, seemed unshakable. But that afternoon, something was wrong. On January 11th, 1974, inside a house in Oceanside, New York, a discovery would change everything. A 31-year-old woman, mother of 3 young children, was found lifeless inside her own home. There were no clear signs of forced entry. No witnesses. No suspicious noises reported. Only silence. And a scene that raised more questions than answers. For decades, this case remained unsolved. A mystery that spanned generations. A family marked by absence. And a name that was never forgotten. But the most disturbing part was not just what happened that day. It was the fact that for years the truth had been hidden. Waiting. Waiting for technology to catch up with the past. Waiting for someone to look at the evidence again. Waiting for the right moment to finally appear. And when that moment came, decades later, the answer was as unexpected as it was silent. If you are interested in real stories like this, cases that remained hidden for years until the truth finally came to light, subscribe to the channel. Because here, every story has a purpose. And some of them waited a lifetime to be told. This is one of those stories. Her name was Barbara Waldman, but to 3 young children aged 7, 6, and just 5 years old, 2 boys and a girl. Too young to understand what was happening inside that house, she was much more than that. She was the mother. The constant presence that kept everything in place, that turned routine into something safe, predictable, almost automatic. Barbara was 31 years old and lived with her family in Oceanside on Long Island, a quiet place where neighbors knew each other and where children could still grow up with a certain sense of freedom. She was married to Harvey Waldman, a local dentist, and together they built a simple, stable life based on routine and caring for their children. It was the kind of ordinary family, the kind that does not draw attention but works precisely because everything is in the right place. She was known as a present and caring woman, the kind people remember with warmth, very loved in the neighborhood, someone who truly made a difference in the lives of those around her, always ready to help, always willing to listen. Barbara was not just another member of the community, she actively participated in the local unit of the Oceanside Cancer Society, dedicating time and energy to people who were often facing the most difficult moments of their lives. She was the kind of person who was there, not out of obligation, but out of care, out of empathy. And maybe that is why, for many, what happened next became even harder to understand. But above all, Barbara was a mother, and her children were still young. They depended on her for everything, from the simplest tasks to that sense of security that only a mother can provide, that quiet certainty that, at the end of the day, everything would be okay. She was the one who organized the day, who was present in the important moments, and also in the quiet ones, the ones no one notices, but that hold everything together. Inside that house, everything revolved around her. And every day, almost like a ritual, Barbara woke up early, prepared her children for school, arranged every detail, watched them leave with backpacks on their shoulders, hurried steps, voices still full of innocence. After the door closed, she stayed, alone. It was in that interval, between the moment her children left and the moment they would return, that time seemed to slow down, small tasks, organizing the house, perhaps a moment of silence, simple things, almost invisible, but that kept life moving. It was an ordinary routine, safe, predictable. And maybe that is exactly what makes this story so hard to accept. Because when a presence like that disappears, it is not just a person who is lost, it is an entire foundation that ceases to exist. Everything that sustained daily life stops making sense. And for those children, still so young, that would mean facing something no one is ever prepared for. And it was on a day just like that, seemingly ordinary like so many others, that everything changed. January 11th, 1974. A day that began like any other, but that would end in a way no one could imagine. That morning, Barbara woke up without hurry, without tension, without any sign that something was about to change. The routine followed as always. The children got ready for school, picked up their backpacks, and left the house with simple thoughts, small worries, like any other day. Barbara stood at the door for a few seconds, watching them leave, still wearing a nightgown and a robe, following them with her eyes until they disappeared from view, as she did every morning. It was just another day. When she closed the door, silence once again took over the house, that quiet interval between the children leaving and the moment they would return. Nothing out of the expected, nothing that drew attention. Everything seemed exactly as it should be. But at some point that morning, or already in the early afternoon, something changed. Without warning, without noise, with no one around to notice, someone entered that house, and from that moment everything would begin to spiral out of control. The minutes that followed could never be reconstructed with precision. What is known is that Barbara was alone. No help, no one to hear her. While outside, the world continued as normal, cars passed by, people followed their routines, and her children were at school, living an ordinary day, not knowing that, at that same moment, something irreversible had happened inside their home. Without knowing, without imagining, hours later, the routine followed its usual path. The children returned home. They entered as they did every day, left their backpacks on the couch, walked through the rooms with the simple expectation of finding their mother there, somewhere, as she always was. They called for her, but there was no response. They called again, hoping to hear her voice, any sign, any movement. And then came the waiting, a silence that, little by little, began to feel wrong. Different heavy. It was at that moment that the youngest, only 5 years old, decided to go upstairs without understanding, without imagining that small action would change her life forever. Each step was accompanied by a silent doubt, but there was still hope, the hope that everything was normal, that her mother would appear at any moment. But she did not. When she entered the bedroom, reality appeared in a way that was impossible to process. Barbara was lying beside the bed, motionless, unresponsive, as if time had stopped in that instant. For a few seconds, there was no understanding, only confusion, fear, and a silence that was no longer empty, it was final. Even being so young, she understood in some way that something was very wrong. The other children came upstairs soon after, and they saw it too. Despair took over the house. Neighbors were called, trying to understand what was happening, trying to help, trying to make some sense of that scene. But there was no explanation. A short time later, the police arrived, and that house, which until then had been a home, stopped being one. It became the beginning of an investigation. Investigators began to observe every detail, realizing that Barbara had been restrained with her hands tied behind her back, still wearing the same clothes from the morning, a nightgown and a robe, as if time had been interrupted in the middle of the routine. Everything indicated that it had happened quickly, in a controlled manner, with no signs of disorder in the house, with no indication that she had any chance to escape. There was a single gunshot wound to the head, and signs that, before that final moment, she had gone through a situation of extreme vulnerability. She was sexually assaulted, something that made that scene even harder to comprehend. Meanwhile, the children were still there, nearby, trying to understand what was happening, surrounded by adults, by voices, by a movement that made no sense to them. And then, a short time later, Barbara's husband, Harvey Waldman, arrived at the scene. Called in a hurry, without fully understanding what had happened, he entered that house expecting answers, but found only a reality impossible to accept. In a matter of hours, everything had changed. And for that family, there was no way to go back. Because from that moment on, nothing that existed before could be rebuilt in the same way. In the first moments, everything seemed too confusing. The house was intact, with no signs of forced entry, with nothing out of place, which made that scene even harder to understand. For the investigators, that raised a troubling possibility. Maybe whoever entered was not a complete stranger. Maybe Barbara had opened the door. Maybe she had trusted. And that is exactly what made everything even more disturbing. As the hours passed, doubts also began to surface, looks, quiet comments throughout the neighborhood, and even suspicions raised behind the scenes of the investigation, including questions about the husband himself, Harvey Waldman, something that naturally became part of the initial lines of inquiry, as happens in cases of this nature. The Nassau County Police began the investigation immediately, securing the area, and starting to reconstruct the final moments of that afternoon, trying to find any detail that could explain what had happened. During the initial collection of evidence, investigators identified biological traces on Barbara's underwear, which confirmed that the victim had been exposed to a situation of extreme violence before the outcome of the crime. At the time, however, forensic technology was still limited, and this material could not be fully analyzed. The evidence was then preserved and stored, kept as part of the case file, in the hope that future advances in science could, one day, reveal answers that at that moment were still out of reach. What remained for the Nassau County Police was to question neighbors, people from nearby houses, residents of the area, anyone who might have seen or heard something out of the ordinary at that time. But no one saw anything. No one heard anything. There were no consistent reports directly connected to the house. It was as if everything had happened in absolute silence. Inside the house, investigators analyzed every detail, every object, every possible piece of evidence, trying to assemble a logical sequence of events. Barbara had been caught off guard, restrained, and had no chance to react. There was no evident struggle throughout the house. There was no attempt to escape. Everything indicated that control of the situation was fast, precise, and cold. As the days passed, a composite sketch was released, based on possible information gathered during the investigation, but no lead resulted in a concrete identification. Suspects were considered, some were questioned, others were eventually ruled out over the course of the investigation. Among them was Harvey himself, who even without evidence linking him to the crime, suspicion became part of his reality. In addition to the pain of loss, he also had to face looks, doubts, and a silent weight coming from everyone around him. And little by little, what began as an urgent search for answers started to turn into something even harder to face, the lack of them. The case remained open, but time was beginning to work against everyone. And while the investigation tried to move forward, an entire family was already beginning to feel the weight of an absence that could not be filled. The days passed and nothing changed. No concrete answers, no arrests, no relief. The investigation remained open, but silence was beginning to take the place where hope once existed. For the police, the case was becoming increasingly difficult, leads went nowhere, suspects were ruled out, and what once seemed close to an answer slowly began to drift away. But, for that family, time did not mean progress. It meant absence. Inside the house, everything had changed, the sounds were different. The routine no longer existed in the same way. And for 3 children, still trying to understand what had happened, the loss was not something that could be explained with words. It was felt every day. In the small things, in the simple moments, in the absence of someone who had always been there. The figure of the mother, who once organized everything, who filled every space, was now only a memory, a presence that could no longer be reached. And growing up like this changes everything. Because it is not just the pain of the moment, it is what comes after. Years passing, important dates coming and going. Moments that should have been shared happening in silence. Meanwhile, outside, the world continued moving forward, people living their routines, stories being written, days beginning and ending as if nothing had happened. As the years went by, those children grew up. They stopped being just children and became teenagers, trying to understand life, while carrying an absence that never stopped existing, while their father, little by little, tried to rebuild what was left, finding a new relationship and moving forward in the only way he could. But for them, nothing truly moved forward. Because their mother's death remained there, frozen in time, like a moment that never fully ended, a chapter. For a long time, it seemed that the case would never have an answer. The years went by, and what was once an active investigation gradually turned into silence. The children grew up, left childhood behind, went through adolescence, and reached adulthood carrying the same question that was never answered. And as the decades passed, the family changed, slowly coming apart, until Harvey himself passed away, never knowing who took his wife's life, and for some, taking with him the weight of a suspicion that could never be completely erased. And as happens in so many cases, Barbara's story began to be seen as just another unsolved mystery, something that remained stuck in the past, distant, almost forgotten by everyone, except by those who truly mattered. Because for Barbara's children, it never ended. They kept remembering, kept searching, refusing to let their mother's story disappear with time. Meanwhile, the evidence remained stored, carefully preserved, like pieces of a puzzle that still made no sense, as if they were simply waiting for the right moment to finally reveal something. And that is exactly what began to change. With advances in forensic science, new possibilities started to emerge, Techniques that did not exist at the time of the crime began to allow deeper and more precise analysis, capable of revealing details that simply could not be seen before. Decades later, more precisely in 2024, after years of insistence from Barbara's children, who were now men and women over 50 years old, the case was finally taken over by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and investigators decided to revisit it, not as it was in the past, but with the resources and technology they now had available. The evidence was taken from the archives and carefully re-examined, subjected to more modern testing, and little by little something began to emerge. A genetic profile. Something small, almost imperceptible, recovered from traces preserved over the years, but that carried enormous potential. For the first time in decades, there was a direction. The data was analyzed, compared and studied with precision, and with the support of experts in genetic genealogy, a new line of investigation began to take shape. Families were mapped, connections started to emerge, and what for so long had been only silence was finally beginning to take form. And what for decades had been only a question began to point to something more concrete, a name. After so many years, so much silence, so many attempts without answers, the case began to move again. And with that, a hope that seemed lost began to reappear. But along with it came a new question: if there was now a name, what did that really mean? And what would come next? The name finally appeared. After decades of silence, of unanswered questions, of an investigation that seemed lost in time, there was now an identity connected to that story. Investigators reached a man who, for years, lived without drawing attention, someone who was part of the same community, who had been there the entire time, nearby, while the case remained unsolved. His name was Thomas Generazio. At the time of the crime, he lived just a few blocks from the Waldman family home, worked in local sanitation, and lived a life that, to anyone observing from the outside, seemed ordinary, discreet, almost invisible. But there was a past that was not so simple. Generazio had previously been detained for assault and for involvement with stolen mail, something that, years later, began to take on a new meaning within the investigation. Even so, what had the greatest impact was not just the name. It was time, because while Barbara's family tried to move forward, rebuilding their lives in the only way they could, while her children grew up carrying that absence every day, he remained there, living normally, without being interrupted, without being held accountable. The connection was only possible thanks to genetic analysis, a process that allowed investigators to connect evidence preserved for decades to a specific family line, something that simply did not exist at the time of the crime. And little by little, the pieces began to fall into place, the proximity, the opportunity, the silence that had never been broken. But there was one detail that made everything even more difficult. Thomas Generazio was no longer alive. He had died years earlier, in 2004, a victim of cancer. And that meant that even with the identification, there would be no arrest, there would be no trial, there would be no moment that so many families wait for, the moment of seeing justice being done. The name existed, the answer too, but it came too late. And for that family, that brought a different kind of pain, because after so many years waiting, the truth finally appeared. But not in the way they needed. After so many years, the answer finally arrived. But it did not bring peace, it did not bring relief. Because, for that family, time never stopped moving, and everything that was lost that day could never be recovered. The children grew up, they moved on in the only way possible. But growing up without a mother is not just an absence, it is something that shows itself in every stage of life, in every achievement, in every moment when she should have been there. Birthdays. Important dates. Difficult decisions. Everything happened without her. And now, decades later, there was a name, an explanation. An answer that the world would consider enough. But for those who lived it, it never is. Because justice is not just knowing who it was. It is being able to confront, it is being able to hear, it is being able to close the chapter. And in this case, that never happened. The man responsible lived his life. He grew old and died without ever answering for what he had done. While, on the other side, an entire family carried the consequences every single day. And maybe that is what makes this story so disturbing. It is not just the crime. It is time. It is silence. It is the feeling that sometimes the truth arrives, but does not resolve anything. And in the end, only the questions remain, the ones that never completely disappear. How could something like this happen inside a home? How did no one see? How did no one hear? And most of all, how many stories like this still exist, waiting for an answer that may never come? Because some truths arrive too late, and some losses never stop hurting.